Welcome back to AnthroDish, the show about food, culture, and identity. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Dugnan. It's been a minute since I released the first half of the 9th season of AnthroDish, so I just wanted to share that we're up and running with the second half of the season from now until around the end of April 2025. The second half is loaded with fantastic guests that are speaking to some of the more intricate and complex parts of our food systems. Immigrant labor, flavor and ingredient sourcing, climate-friendly crops, and the commodification of different elements that we take more for granted, like water. I'm really excited to release the second half, and I look forward to sharing more with you as they come out. This week, we're exploring the idea of the food citizen, or perhaps more accurately, the absent food citizen, with Isabela Bonnevera. Isabela is a doctoral researcher at the ICTA-UAB and engages with participatory methods to explore how immigrants are shaping sustainable food transitions in cities. She also examines how sustainable food practices impact food justice outcomes for immigrant communities. I met Isabela through her work as the co-founder of Feminist Food Journal, which is an award-winning magazine and podcast definitely worth checking out. Additionally, she is the editor of Urban Agriculture and Forced Displacement, a forthcoming volume for the Springer Urban Agriculture series. In today's episode, Isabela unpacks the idea of food citizenship, who's involved in defining it, how immigrants are often framed or defined in food policies, the power of language to shape the meanings of terms like healthy or sustainable or cultural foods, and the consequences of exclusion in food policy writing. I could quite honestly speak with Isabela forever about this topic, as she has really illuminated some of the under-considered elements to these issues. Here's my conversation with Isabela. All right, welcome to the show, Isabela. How are you doing today?
I'm doing so great, Sarah. How are you?
Good. I'm so excited to finally connect. We've kind of connected online through writing and Substack for a long time, but to be able to chat with you about your research is such a pleasure. And before we kind of go into the bigger topics, do you mind sharing a bit of a snapshot of who you are, where you're coming in from today, and the type of work that you're doing?
Definitely. So, hi, I'm Isabela Bonnevera. I am probably, to sum it up, a food researcher and a writer. My pronouns are she, her. I grew up in what is now commonly known as Vancouver, in Richmond, BC to be exact, which some people might say is like a sad side suburb. I say that it is a very dynamic city, and I think we have one of the richest food cultures in the world. And I grew up in a family that was obsessed with food. So my mom is from a Jewish Canadian family for whom food was like everything in the household, and my dad is from Chile. So there's a lot of movement in my family history, which I feel has also defined a lot of my life. And I've lived now, so I'm from Vancouver originally, but I've lived now in Europe for almost 10 years. I was based in Berlin, where I did my master's, then in France, now in Barcelona. I'm in Barcelona doing my PhD in environmental policy with the Institute for Environmental Science and Technology at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. So I wear a few different hats professionally. I'm doing my PhD, as I mentioned. I also work as an independent consultant focused on food policy issues, and I run Feminist Food Journal, which is another magazine here on Substack, which is how I got to connect with Sarah originally, publishing writing from around the world at the intersection of food, feminism, culture, politics, and identity. So yeah, what ties all my work together is this focus on food and culture and the relationship between food systems change and social justice, we can say.
Amazing. I applaud you for being so concise and sharing like all of the different things that you do, because you do truly wear so many hats. And I find, especially when you're juggling all of that in the midst of a PhD too, at least in my mind, like I always felt like I was kind of talking in scrambled eggs when I was trying to like speak to all the different pieces. So I love the through lines that you're exploring in that. And I wanted to kind of come back to that idea of movement within food, particularly given your experiences growing up and the research that you do. So what about that sort of construct of movement through food systems do you look at, or what parts interest you the most as a researcher?
So right now my PhD is really focused on looking at the intersections of food justice for immigrant communities, mostly in the global north, and sustainable food transformations. So efforts mostly by cities and city governments to make food systems more sustainable. And I think this was born sort of out of two things. One is that growing up in Vancouver, I feel like I really saw like the rise of the alternative food movement being something that was really honestly quite white, and that, you know, in Vancouver and Richmond, especially where I grew up, is an extremely culturally diverse city, and feeling like a lot of the activities around food, whether that was food production, say, or food selling, were really like the immigrant communities involved in that were really being left out of the narrative. So that was one sort of impetus for my project. And the other one is just my experience, like having now been an immigrant for, I guess, almost a third of my life. Like really knowing what it's like to kind of move to a new environment, not understand a food environment necessarily very well, not speak the language very well, and not be able to maybe get involved with as many initiatives like in the city, in your community, as you would like to, and as you might feel you would be able to in your home country. So that's sort of where the idea originally came from. I trained, yeah, first as a sociologist, and I did a master's degree in public policy. And after that, I did a certificate in food systems with Toronto Metropolitan University online. And it was also through there that I really started focusing on the topic of sustainable food. And of course, with the link between food and climate change, for example, this seemed like a really sort of important nexus to be focusing on, but feeling like the justice aspect of that was really being left out in a lot of things I was reading. So that sort of then pushed me to apply for some funding, which thankfully I got to do my
Yay!
PhD. Yay, the Canadian Social Sciences Humanities Research Council. They came through for me.
Excellent. Which is so key, especially for this sort of research. And I think, you know, you're speaking to Richmond and Vancouver and how, you know, multicultural and diverse those areas are, and even thinking about what those cities look like versus Toronto in terms of the diversity of foods and of immigrants in the diaspora there. Even within our, you know, within Canada, those two are very unique in their own food pathways as well. So can you speak a little bit to, you know, within your work, you're looking at this idea of food citizenship, and you mentioned like alternative food movements. So can you kind of explain what alternative food movements tend to look like and what a food citizen is kind of in relation to that?
Definitely. So yeah, I just published my first paper, which is titled New Food Cultures in the Absent Food Citizen, Immigrants and Urban Food Policy in Agriculture and Human Values. And like you said, this looked at the concept of food citizenship and who is a food citizen. And food citizen has really been a term that's been used a lot in alternative food movements, say the kind that became really popular, like in the 2010s, say with like the California food movement, with the writing of like Mark Bittman, for example, and Michael Pollan. And usually like this food citizen is like, this title is used to denote someone who participates in activities that work towards a better, fairer food system, right? So like buying local foods, buying foods that support more like the use of agroecological practices and production, better labor conditions, fairer returns for farmers. You know, I think it's come to denote often someone who votes with their fork, who is like aware of key environmental and social issues around food, and who also participates in some way in collective actions to fight for a better food system. So when I breaking down the concept, like other models of citizenship, I think food citizenship can be thought of as being about obligations, rights, and also belonging in some ways. And I'm trying to look at food citizenship at a city level. And I'm looking at cities specifically because cities right now have sort of become a locus really of food systems change. There's something called the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact, which is like a non-binding international agreement where over, I think, 200 cities now have pledged to promote more sustainable food systems at a city level. So that's sort of a guiding fora. There's a lot of events and like other networks, shall we say, that city officials can participate in to share information on this. And I think the idea has been that as it can be very hard to shift, say, like federal policy or national policy related to sustainability, that cities are able to act more nimbly in certain areas. Of course, not every area. I mean, we can chat about that a little bit more later. So that's why I've been looking at cities, and I'm very interested in these. They're called urban food policies. Essentially, these are strategies that cities are creating, cities that sign on to the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact, to lay out what are the current problems in the food system in the city, what is the ideal vision for the food system in the city, and what activities do they need to get there, and what does essentially the idealized food system look like. So I'm kind of looking at these urban food policies as documents that create a vision for food citizenship. So for example, what rights the city wants to provide residents with regards to food, And again, not everything is within the remit of cities, which makes it tricky. Cities in some ways might be hamstrung on solving very deep structural inequalities that relate to state or national policy. But they also lay out obligations, so like what obligations would expect from people in the city. How should people engage with the food system in order to reach the city's goals around sustainable food? They lay out, in that sense, also like what is sustainable food, and we can dig into that a bit more later, and also what belonging would look like. So concretely, say like obligations, cities will be like, okay, we're going to increase the amount of farmers markets, and we want people to shop at those, for example. Or we want to increase the amount of community gardens, and a policy is just a paper without people to bring it to life. So ideally, then you're going to have people who are using those gardens, and then the vision of belonging that is set out in the model of food citizenship created by these policies, then is sort of tied to participating in these activities that it wants people to engage in. And sometimes there are real benefits to that. Like some cities do pledge to put money behind, say, like shortening supply chains. So they're going to provide like subsidies to businesses that stock more local food, for example, or incentives for public institutions to buy food from local producers. So in a nutshell, these policies just create a vision of who's a citizen, a food citizen, and what that relationship looks like. What academics would call very jargony and imaginary, which is sort of the idealized collective vision. And there can be hegemonic imaginaries that come from the state, and then there can be also counter-imaginaries. So these are really the state originating, let's say, more hegemonic imaginary of what that relationship to food can look like.
It's interesting you bring up the word the imaginary. I was just reading The Message, like the Ta-Nehisi Coates book, and he talks about like the power of the imaginary or the power of the imagination to create like a vision of the future or like a vision of an alternative to the system to kind of keep you motivated when you're doing, the work of social justice or activism or pieces like that as well. So, in my mind, I'm kind of thinking through that, like as I was reading through your article, and something that you so adeptly address within it is, not only who a food citizen is, but also the absent food citizen. So do you mind speaking a little bit to, who's allowed to belong within food citizenship within these policies and who tends to be missing from these policies?
For sure. So as I mentioned at the beginning, my work focuses on immigrants specifically. And this is for sort of, two different reasons. One is that there is a body of food studies literature that looks at how immigrants have been historically excluded from alternative food movements. So the kind I was talking about in the early 2010s that were more grassroots, less institutionalized, but often had sort of like a hostile, unwelcoming racial politics. They were very white spaces and also excluded people in more vulnerable socioeconomic situations, which include large groups of immigrants. And I'm also looking at immigrants for the reason that immigrants have specific needs and roles and subjectivities vis-a-vis the food system. And one of my mentors, Walapak Polisab, who's the research and extension manager at Kwantlen Polytechnic University, actually in Richmond. So it's nice to have had the chance to connect a bit back home. Last year did a really interesting study on the barriers to local food systems participation for newcomers and immigrants in Canada. And found that barriers, of course, are not only socioeconomic, so it's not only about being able to afford food or having geographic access to food. There's also linguistic barriers. There's political barriers. People don't feel necessarily comfortable participating in events like political events related to food or don't know how. So for those two reasons, I'm looking specifically at immigrants and also with the idea that a lot of cities in the global north that have urban food policies have become increasingly multicultural or are already very multicultural. The majority of immigrants to the global north settle in cities. So I think it's a very pertinent issue, right? When we're thinking about, okay, so suddenly so many cities are developing these policies and how are huge chunks of the population being reflected in these. So I've gone through, I'm trying to think about, how are immigrants considered food citizens thinking about these special roles in the food system or not? So first what I can say, maybe I can talk about, there are ways that immigrants are framed in the policies and then ways that they are left out or not mentioned at all.
Yeah, so let's speak about how they're framed first, because I think that's a really important piece. Like I know throughout the podcast this season, we've been talking a lot about, immigrant labor in the food system in particular and like kind of extractive and exploitive labor policies, even thinking through in Canada, quite often when we're looking at immigrants making headlines, at least in 2024. We're seeing a lot of visas and kind of like the political constructs of those. So how are immigrants reflected in the food policy to begin with?
So yeah, I found that in about half the policies reference immigrants specifically as a group that lives in the city and relates them to the food system in some way. Um, More often than not, and actually overwhelmingly, immigrants are framed as vulnerable in the policy. So they're listed along with vulnerable groups. And sometimes this can look like refugees, but often they're named among groups, say, like single parent households, houseless individuals, etc., as groups who are vulnerable. And therefore, usually this is in relation also to food security, for example, so having enough food to eat. And this, of course, this can be true in some ways. And like I mentioned, there are often socioeconomic, linguistic, political barriers to engaging with the food system. But it's also not all there is to the story. And there's sort of a nascent body of literature that shows how immigrants also hold valuable knowledge and skills related to sustainable food. And a second part of my PhD that's more bottom up is actually looking at this, working with immigrant women to understand how they conceptualize sustainable food, and how they renegotiate this concept of sustainability. And it shows that people are actively engaging with the concept, right? Even if they themselves might not frame it in those terms or might not be recognized institutionally. So I think that's a bit problematic, that often immigrants are framed as only people who are vulnerable or in need, especially like food aid, for example, or in situations of poverty. I think only 2 policies of the 22 that I looked at from around the world actually named immigrants as knowledge holders with regards to
Wow.
food in some ways. So that, yeah, so that obviously that kind of follows the hypothesis that I had. I hate to be disappointed. But that was something that I found was really this focus on vulnerability as sort of the only element of that identity category that was worth mentioning. And then I guess there was another stream of what I found in policies was that they would sort of reference neighborhoods with significant concentrations of immigrant communities as in need of dietary intervention on the basis there that people are unhealthy or have poor diets or make poor choices or don't know enough about food. And often this was not done explicitly. So the policies would reference neighborhoods, say there's in Copenhagen and in Paris as well, neighborhoods that if you do extra research or you know about those cities, you realize have a heavy concentration of immigrant populations living there, but it's not called out in the policy. Yet those neighborhoods will be mentioned as places where there's a high rate of non-communicable disease, for example, related to diets, and sort of targeting these areas for change and framing them as problematic against the imaginary idealized food system goals laid out in the policy. So that was a really jarring and interesting finding. And I think, yeah, I think another way that immigrants are framed but also not really framed is that are framed but also not really thoughtfully considered, is that quite a few policies talk about promoting the city as cosmopolitan or diverse food culture as a really important element of its food system. You know, a lot of cities talk about wanting to become foodie destinations, desirable food destinations, and they relate that to having very multicultural food cultures that they can be a part of. But very, very few policies recognize that it's often immigrant labor that maintains those culturally diverse food economies, right? I think in the New York policy did actually reference the fact that a lot of immigrants work in food-related industries, and this is often a way for them to sort of get a foot in the door, you know, when they arrive in America, etc. But beyond that, very few, almost no policies really discussed how the labor in these sectors is very precarious, and how that could then be examined as part of a sustainable food system shift, for example. So a lot of sort of profiting off these food cultures that immigrants underpin, but not looking at how to support their livelihoods.
Yeah, it's such a stark contrast when you paint it that way too, because I think I interviewed someone last season, Maggie Leandra, who has a Kitchens of Toronto series. So she looks at different kitchens and small immigrant businesses that are running through Toronto, and how,
So cool.
they're really the backbone of Toronto food. Like Toronto quite often is, doesn't necessarily have a culture without the immigrant foods that shape the food system there. And as you said, like I think particularly about these small businesses and how they paint entire neighborhoods, entire understandings of a city experience without that care. Um, I think also something that was coming up, like I work as a consultant outside of this in environmental assessments and things like that. And my former employer, we did like a lot of these sorts of city policy documents or like we were contracted out, and quite often like they were templates that you kind of like copied and pasted and stuck things in without, there's definitely thought put into it, but on budgets. And so I think a lot about what you're saying too, in terms of who's writing this, and then the real life consequences of something that's done with like this really tiny little budget to hit, a city quota as well.
Definitely. And I think I don't want to sound like I'm also that I'm coming after city officials. I think I didn't examine explicitly how policies were created. It wouldn't have been possible for this amount of policies that I looked at. And I think discourse is important to look at in its own right by what it sort of centers, right, as the norm and what it frames as deviant. And there is a body of research that started to look at, say, like cultural diversity on food policy councils and try to tie this to outcomes in terms of food systems activities. And I think that's a really interesting thing to look at, is like to what degree are people from diverse backgrounds included in policy creation processes? And what does that mean for the final policy document? And totally, like I spoke to someone who'd worked on a city food strategy, and she said it was pretty much just her. Like she was the only consultant. The budget was tiny. They didn't have, the bandwidth to do any consultations with a lot of communities or anything really meaningful. So that's also really tough.
Yeah, it's a frustrating thing to witness, and to kind of understand how these sorts of like abstract concepts come into a reality as well. So I wanted to kind of switch gears a little bit, because you had mentioned earlier on like the understanding of language barriers within this concept of food citizenship, within food policy, in urban spaces. Can you speak a little bit to the role that language plays in, how food policies are experienced, and what sorts of words or terms can be kind of challenging from like an immigrant perspective within these food policies?
Yeah, definitely. So I think first of all, maybe we can talk about the definitions of healthy and sustainable food. And something that I've realized through the second part of my PhD, which is this participatory action research, is that the word sustainable actually doesn't have a lot of doesn't translate to a lot of different languages.
Wow.
And it doesn't resonate with a lot of communities, and people didn't know what it was, and they looked it up, and I think positioning healthy and sustainable food as a goal without defining what you mean by healthy and sustainable and to whom, and recognizing the multiplicity of definitions of this to people of different communities can be very problematic. So every policy essentially across the board wanted to promote healthy food and sustainable food. These were buzzwords that came up in every single policy that I looked at. And at first blush, they might appear neutral, but when you look into it, you're like, okay, what does this really mean? And then you start to see whose subjectivities are being centered there, whose bodies, whose food habits, whose cultures are centered in that. I realized that quite a few policies in North America were looking at food pyramids, so government disseminated food pyramids, and defining that as healthy food and sticking that in the policy. And I was really thinking about, there's been a lot of work done already on food pyramids, is often presenting a very Eurocentric version of health and foods that don't resonate, with necessarily a variety of communities. But I was thinking a lot about the inclusion of dairy products, say, for example. Yeah. And at Feminist Food Journal, we had a milk issue where we looked at the dietary racism embedded in a lot of projects in North America and government programs to promote milk consumption. When the vast majority of the world actually isn't lactase persistent and can't digest the lactose that's present in a lot of milk products. So when policies are talking about healthy foods and trying to promote, say, dairy products, for a lot of people, that food is not biologically accessible for them to consume. I also saw a lot of healthy and sustainable food, especially in European policies, being tied to sort of traditional, but also largely like white traditional foodways. Right. A lot of policies talked about promoting healthy and sustainable food, and they were like, this is Spanish food, or British food, for example, the Mediterranean diet, without really unpacking what that means. If such a diet exists, what is Spanish food? And in some cases, I think it was in, yeah, a UK policy tied that directly to environmental sustainability. So, for example, they're like, well, British food, it doesn't need to be grown in a greenhouse. It can be grown right in the field. So kind of tying this idea of this, like, yeah, this dominant
Mm.
national diet to ecological goals and something that can be grown locally. At the same time, sort of, a lot of policies also say they want to promote the consumption of culturally appropriate food in the city, and it's kind of tacked on in a long list of adjectives, right? Um, at the Very few try to unpack what culturally appropriate means. It's often used to denote difference. I think it's used as sort of a proxy for ethnic difference, for example.
Hmm.
And it's often mentioned in conjunction with mentions to immigrant communities, and say like an immigrant food producer producing culturally appropriate food, which is correct. I mean, that makes sense, but then it's also not used in other places, and I think using culture as a proxy for ethnicity can also be tricky because
Yeah.
everybody has a culture, right? People who are racialized as white also have culture, and a lot of our dietary decisions in Eurocentric ways of eating are also driven by culture, say very meat heavy diets, very dairy heavy diets. And I think trying to paint only certain communities as having culture as a barrier to change can be problematic. I'm veering slightly off topic here,
No,
but
no, it's so interesting though, because it's what goes back to what you're saying too about when looking at how immigrants are framed through food policy. Quite often, there's like this um, dietetic or nutritional component of being in poor nutrition or being at risk of poor nutrition because of food insecurity, that doesn't really get at that idea of cultural foods or traditional food knowledge. And I think even about the challenges of like moving to a new city, a new country where you're thinking about how to access foods that you knew how to use at home, or substitutions that would be appropriate for what sorts of dishes you're cooking as well. And it strikes me that there's like a little bit of a divide in terms of um, what the challenges are and what the actual consequences of that are in comparison to how it's framed in like a nutritional standpoint as well.
yeah, yeah, definitely. And then I guess you were talking about the issue of language, and I was just thinking about like language in a different way, like linguistic accessibility.
Yeah.
Um, a lot of these policies want to promote, say, like shortening supply chains, promoting local food in the city, having more local food in stores. Again, local is the kind of a vague concept that's often not really defined. But very few policies talked about producing more culturally appropriate foods close to cities, um, and
Mm.
what that could look like. And the Tyee, which is a Vancouver-based newspaper, had a really great series about a year and a half ago on what kind of local cultural foods get overlooked. And I think they looked at maybe 4 or 5 different products like beef ball, paneer tofu that are all being made actually
Mm.
quite close to Vancouver and sold fresh. But they don't really get considered as part of the local food movement. And there's a lot of challenges for business owners, say around like permits. Like there's so much work that you have to do, right, to be able to open a food business,
Hmm.
and not having that available in a lot of different languages can be really, really daunting. Access to capital, for example, for startup costs is always a really big challenge, and very few policies outlined how they might be able to support with those kind of barriers, say, either.
Yeah, which is pretty significant too, particularly, you spoke earlier to this idea of like quite often a policy is just paper, right, until it put into play. And so can you speak a little bit to the consequences of these food policy documents, and the tensions that you identified, the sorts of contrasting or contentious sorts of pieces in it? What are those consequences for immigrants that are having to live through these food policy decisions in real time?
Yeah, so I should say this with a caveat. Of course, my study didn't look at this. I really just
Yeah.
focused on the policy. Um, and I think that was an area I proposed it into my paper for further research, would be to look at like how this plays out on the ground and how this affects people. But I think from what I saw, at least, let's say the policy was implemented at, like these policies were implemented as planned, which does not always happen,
Mm.
again, for the same budgetary and
Yeah.
human resource capacity issue that you mentioned. So it could be that this is just a paper and nothing ever happens with it. I still think the discourse is important because of, like I said, this imaginary that it legitimizes. But there's a few different ways that this could play out. I think one is with these, and we can think about maybe here different pillars of justice, right? So we can think about, say, distributional justice, which has to do with the equitable distribution of resources. And I think one way here, I mentioned earlier, is that when concrete financial rewards are on the table for businesses that are stocking local foods, or for producers to produce more local foods for businesses, or for public institutions to buy more local food, sometimes when they have provision, say, in their, oh my God, what's the word I'm looking for? Procurement. Oh my God, a procurement clause. Thank you. To bring more local food in, right? If cities aren't thinking about how to connect immigrant food producers, immigrant food businesses into those shorter supply chains, they're going to miss out on some of those benefits. So that's one way. Another way I think has to do then with political participation and participatory justice. So if immigrants don't feel that if policies haven't, if they either haven't thought about immigrants as an important group in the city with specific needs and roles in the food system, it means that they might not be doing the same type of outreach work, for example, or overlooking them really in policy and planning. And I think another impetus for this research was a body of research focused not specifically on sustainable food, but on sustainability policy more broadly, who found that a lot of policymakers look at, this was one study in Manchester, another one in Sweden, can look at immigrant communities, especially racialized immigrant communities, people who are racialized as ethnic minorities, can look at them as like either hard to reach, for example, not interested in sustainability, or for whom culture is like a barrier to change, right? So I think if communities aren't consulted, and my participatory action research has really found a lot of evidence to the contrary on this. But I think if that's not reflected in policy documents, and those policy documents then shape policy and programming, it means that maybe the right targeted outreach and the right languages is not going to reach the right communities and people who are extremely important to the food system and have the right to participate and often have a desire to participate are going to be overlooked.
Yeah. I know, so this is not something that you tackled in the paper either, but I'm curious to get your perspective on, what are some pathways that might work to begin to incorporate more immigrant lenses within food policy and the work around that as well?
Yeah, I think again, it's always like a problem of budget and human resources, but I found the participatory action research that I've done for my PhD, it requires a lot of really robust consultation with communities and spending a lot of time with people to understand what the concept of good or sustainable food means to them. But I really think that type of robust community consultation is essential in the formulation of any policy document, and then also creating programs and subsequent policies from that document. I think you need to look. I think NGOs are always great gatekeepers in these ways, and I worked with an amazing organization in Vancouver called the Pacific Immigrant Resources Society that connected me to, actually, I could only take 8 people in my project, and I had almost 32 or 33 applicants of people who really wanted to talk about food issues in their community. So I think the appetite to engage with food systems issues is there for sure, and food is something that it's so central to our daily lives, and it impacts all of us so much. I think people are really eager to talk about both their challenges with food they like, and also connect with others around food. So I think, I would love to see cities doing more robust community consultations in the formulation of urban food policies and plans, and really creating a forum where people can not only provide input to the city, but also take something away from it. And I think in my subsequent study after my first paper, was really valuable for these women to come together and have a chance to actually discuss food issues as a group. And they felt that was very politically powerful and very empowering. And then they get something from the experience as well in the short term.
Yeah, which is so important, and it does have like ripple effects for how people feel navigating these food systems on the day-to-day too, if they know that there's this opportunity to discuss, to meet, to come together over that too. I think a lot about, like, when I was doing my PhD work, it was very much based on like what the community actually wanted, and it always surprises me how little that is asked in these sorts of like top-down approaches. It's just like, as you were saying, like listening to local perspectives and coming at it with an understanding that it's going to be more complex, and it must, in order to like accurately, or not accurately, but to fit within the food systems that are local, complex, and diverse. You need these solutions that are much more multifaceted and much more tailored to the particular groups of people that are living in those spaces.
And then I guess, oh, sorry, I'm circling back here, but something else I just thought of
Yeah.
of that part was that I think when we think about also implications, and thinking about, say, material rewards and also political participation, I was also thinking just now about recognitional justice and who counts as a food citizen in the eyes of not only, say, the city, but also other people who are engaged in food systems activities. Mm-hmm. And I think what I also saw in a lot of these policies, because of this, I don't want to say extreme focus on local food, but say like ubiquitous focus on local food, I think it also runs the risk of eventually, as also people become ideally and hopefully more and more engaged with the fight against climate change, demonizing certain foods that come from far away. And I think including, say, the adjective culturally acceptable in a list of adjectives like healthy, sustainable, and culturally acceptable food doesn't show how those goals should be prioritized. In the end, there are always going to have to be trade-offs when certain policy decisions are made. And I think without looking at how there can be support for certain producers to produce foods closer to the city, to sell them in the city, I think then it runs the risk of demonizing foods that come from far away, which everybody eats, right? Not just immigrants. Yeah. But I know from my experience with this participatory action research that obviously there are often some foods that people cannot source locally that are extremely important to them, to how their mental health, they feel to their physical health as well. So I think that's something that, I think there's the risk of then stigmatizing foods that come from longer supply chains.
Yeah, that's an interesting point that you raised too. And I think even about like specialty stores, like when you go to different parts of the city and like my daughter's half Polish. And so I would go out to this like particular store to get these particular types of pickles that were just like in this giant bucket on the ground. And they were like the most delicious and you could only get them there, but it was sourced directly from Poland. So those sorts of considerations of like, what does that look like? As you said, like for mental health, for feelings of like cultural belonging, as well as belonging within the new city that you're in as well.
Those sound delicious.
Yeah, they were so good. That store closed during COVID and I was so devastated because it was just like the best deli bakery ever.
Oh, I love it. One of my favorite places in Richmond, it's called Excellent Tofu and Snack. It's tiny. But the owner, he makes all the soy milk and the soy milk pudding himself in these giant paint buckets. And there's like 12 buckets going behind the counter and they're steaming and there's the hose. And it's just so good.
That's delicious. Oh, that's incredible. Oh, well, thank you so much, Isabella. It's such a pleasure chatting with you. And like, I already have a million other questions for another episode down the way. But do you mind sharing where folks can find you if they want to learn more about your research and all the other projects that you have going on as well?
Definitely. Folks can find me at Isabela Bonnevera, BONNEVERA.com. And I'll have a link there to both this paper and also my participatory action project, which is called the Good Food Project. And there's going to be a lot more information coming out about that in the next few months. People took pictures in response to our research questions. We're going to have a photo book and a video. And we presented our findings to the Vancouver Food Policy Council. So I'm going to upload the slides there.
Oh, that's going to be amazing. I can't wait. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. It was great to connect.
That was Isabela Bonnevera. I've linked Feminist Food Journal and her recent article on food citizenship in agriculture and human values in the show notes below if you want to follow along and learn more. You can also find all this at our website at AnthroDish.com under episodes. Thanks so much for listening to AnthroDish Podcast. Subscribe to this show on YouTube or Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you like us, please rate us on Apple Podcasts to help get the word out. For more AnthroDish and definitely more regular communication in the off-season, sign up for my newsletter at sarahdougnan.substack.com, or you can find me on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, or Threads at AnthroDish Podcast. I always love hearing from you and what you've been thinking about food. Sound editing, intro music, and production was done by Lucas Wojcicki at lucassound.com. AnthroDish is produced in partnership with the American Anthropological Association. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll catch you next week.